All right, so welcome to our fancy online lecture on human freedom and the self by Roderick Chisholm. So as you're listening to this, you can just follow along. I recommend having your textbook open. I will be reading from some passages from the textbook like I normally do in class, and so feel free to read along with me. And of course, you can pause the video at any point and take things at your own pace. You might even consider writing up your reading response as you're working through this lecture. The prompt for the reading response is on Canvas now, and I've pushed the due date back on that to December 5th. So the fourth reading response will be due on Wednesday, December 5th, as opposed to Monday, December 3rd, and at the usual time. So start of class, you'll need to have a digital copy uploaded to Canvas and a hard copy brought with you to class. Okay, so with that being said, let's dig in to the material. So before we begin to look at what Chisholm's argument is in Human Freedom and the Self, we should get a couple of concepts and definitions out on the table so we can begin to think about these issues in a more sophisticated way. Now, the concept of free will is one that is notoriously problematic. And what I've done here is giving you a general definition of freedom of the will. We can think of free will as being synonymous with free choice or free action. And the definition that I have for you here is one that most philosophers would agree upon in some general way. Various philosophers might quibble over some of the technical distinctions and defining the term, but generally this is a definition that most philosophers would get on board with. And this is to say that what we're speaking of when we're speaking of free will is an agent's actions and choices. In particular, that an agent's actions and choices are free only if an agent's actions and choices are A, up to them, and B, they could have done otherwise. Now, it's the second part of the definition here, part B, they could have done otherwise, which is really the crux of the issue of freedom of the will. Now, what we mean when an individual acts freely is that the action proceeds from them. Right? The agent wasn't being coerced to do something against their will, in scare quotes, that the action flows from the agent themselves, that the agent is the source of the action. So this is usually what we mean when we're talking about free will. But a bit more technically, what we mean when we're talking about free will is that an agent couldn't have done otherwise other than what it was that they did do. So, for instance, normally we think that an action is free because we could have made some other choice than what it was that we did choose. So I decide to get up and go to work, for instance, and we think of that as a volitional action because we could have done differently, right? We could have stayed in bed, hit the snooze button a few more times, maybe just turned off the alarm and stayed under our warm covers and not gotten up and gone to school or gone to work. But let's say we do choose to go to school or go to work. We think of ourselves as engaging in a meaningful action in such an instance because we could have done otherwise than what it was that we did do. Now, if we were in a situation where what we did do wasn't up to us and we couldn't have done otherwise than what it was that we did do, then it would seem that we really have no say in how that particular state of affairs unfolds. It looks like we have a genuine choice when we make a decision, when we can do something other than what it is that we decide to do. So this is crucial for understanding free will, freedom of choice, and freedom of action. An agent's actions and choices are free only if an agent's actions and choices are A, up to them, and B, they could have done otherwise. Now, a concept of free will implies this capacity to have done otherwise. And this capacity to have done otherwise, having a number of options at one's disposal when making a decision, seems to underlie our ascriptions of moral responsibility. So, for instance, when someone does something wrong, right? Say you do something to me and I'm upset with you for doing it. Oftentimes I will either praise you or blame you for what it is you have done because I think that you could have done otherwise than what it was that you did do. So if you come up and slap me in the face, I'm going to be pretty upset by that. Yeah? I'm not going to be happy, and I'm going to blame you for slapping me in the face. And the reason why I'm going to blame you is because I think that it's within your power in that instance to have not slapped me in the face, right? And your being able to not slap me in the face is what makes me think that it's really wrong when you do in fact slap me in the face. So the capacity to have done otherwise underlies our ascriptions of moral responsibility. Now you might think, well, we still blame people even if they couldn't have done otherwise than what it was they did do, right? So maybe somebody commits a crime and we find out that they committed the crime under duress or that they were suffering from some neurological or physiological impairment which made them behave in a way that they normally wouldn't behave. And we do have special categories for that in the law. And it's true that we still do punish people for engaging in behavior that we don't like, but our ascriptions of moral responsibility are significantly dampened and lessened if we know that a person doesn't have the capacity to do otherwise than what it was that they did do. So the capacity to have done otherwise is really the backbone of our ascriptions of moral responsibility. This is what many philosophers think and have thought. So an agent is morally responsible for their actions and choices only if those actions and choices are free, right? It would be weird for me to hold you morally responsible for something that you had no choice about, right? So if you were determined to do a particular action, you had no choice other than to do what it was that you did do. Now you have to think about this, right? Most of us have a subjective feeling of freedom of choice. But if it turned out that in a particular instance, say somebody made you do something with a gun to your head and you just had no choice but to do it, the level of moral responsibility that we assign to you in that particular instance is going to be very different than if we knew that you were undertaking that action upon your own deliberation, right? That you had some other options available to you. If all of those other options are taken away, then it seems that your moral responsibility, you being morally responsible for the action, is taken away as well. Okay, so we've got a couple of concepts out on the table now. Free will or free choice. An agent's actions and choices are free only if an agent's actions and choices are A, up to them, and B, they could have done otherwise. And this capacity to have done otherwise underlies our ascriptions of moral praise and blame. Okay, so here's a metaphor to start thinking about this problem of free will and determinism. So in the literature, this metaphor has been used to help clarify some of the issues that are at stake. And what we are asked to do is to imagine a garden of forking paths. So here's our garden of forking paths. And you're walking down this long road here, and you reach this fork in the road, or you've got three different options here, but you reach a point in the road where it seems to you that there are a number of different options that you can take. You can go down road A, you can go down road B, or you could go down road C. And most of the time when we make choices, we think of ourselves as making choices in this way, that when we make a choice, there are a number of different possibilities open to us. And this is why we think some of our choices are genuinely important, because things could go one way or the other, depending upon the type of choice that we make. So normally we think about making choices in this way. We have these various alternate possibilities open to us. And let's say we're walking down the garden path here and we reach the fork in the road and we decide to go down path B. Now, when we decide to go down path B, what we might say is that you're responsible for making the choice of going down path B because you could have made the choice of going down either path A or going down path C. And most of our choices seem to be like this. We make a choice to go down a particular path or to engage in a particular behavior or action, but we could have done otherwise. We could have chose A or we could have chose C. We happen to have chosen B, but other possibilities were genuinely open to us at that particular moment when we made that decision. And we'll call the moment in which we make that decision time one. Right? So there's a particular moment in time where we make the decision to go down path B. Yeah? And when we make that decision, our common everyday intuition suggests to us that although we chose to go down path B, we could have chosen to go down either path A or path C. Okay, so here's where things start to get a little complicated. Determinism is the view that for every event, action, or effect that occurs, a cause or causes exist. So determinism is a metaphysical position on the nature of the cosmos. And what this states is that for any event which occurs, there is some previous cause or some previous set of causes which brought about that event. Right? So for anything which occurs, any event which occurs, you sitting at your computer now, listening to this lecture, there is some previous causal chain which has led up to the particular moment in which you find yourself. Now this suggests something odd. If every event, action, or effect that occurs has a cause or causes, then there's really only one continuation of the state of things at a given moment, which is consistent with the laws of nature. Okay, so there's only one continuation of the state of things at a given moment, which is consistent with the laws of nature. Okay, so this starts to get a little abstract here, but this is the way to think about it. For any given moment that you find yourselves in, you sitting at your computer, listening to this lecture, there's some prior causal chain which has led up to that particular moment, right? So there was something that caused you to sit down at the computer, there was something that caused you to click at the link, and now you find yourself in the moment where you're watching the lecture, and there's this long causal chain which has led up to this particular moment. And what determinism states is that given that causal chain, which has led up to this particular moment, in conjunction with the laws of nature, there is really only one way in which things will unfold at a given time. So if you take that antecedent causal chain in conjunction with the laws of nature, What that suggests is that there's really only one way in which things will unfold at that moment. So what determinism states is that the way in which events unfold at a given time is determined by natural laws. And this is to suggest that there is really only one physically possible future at any given moment. Now, this seems counterintuitive to us because it seems like in a given moment, especially when we make a choice, that there are a number of different physically possible futures which could unfold at that moment. But what determinism states is that given the causal antecedents which have led up to the present moment in conjunction with the laws of nature, there is really only one way in which things will unfold. This is the doctrine of determinism. It states that all events in the universe are predetermined, that there's really only one way in which things will unfold, given how things were. You can push it as far back as you like to, let's say, the beginning of the universe. And the beginning of the universe, the way in which things unfold then, in conjunction with the laws of nature, determines that things will happen in exactly the way that they're going to happen. So really, when we're looking at our garden of forking paths, well, normally it seems to us at T1, at time 1, that we have a number of different options available to us. We could go down path A, we could go down path B, or we could go down path C. We decide to go down path B, but when we make that decision, we recognize that we're making a genuine decision because we could have gone down path A or gone down path C. We just happen to choose to go down path B. Now, if determinism's true, that for every event, action, or effect that occurs, a cause or causes exists, and that this entails that at any given moment there is only one physically possible future which can come about, then our garden of forking paths doesn't really look like this. If we just zoom in a little bit closer, we'll see that the path looks more like this. It seemed to us at first as if we had a genuine choice to go down path A, path B, or path C, and we happened to choose B, but we could have chosen A or C. If determinism is true, then what the situation looks like is really like this, our bottom garden of forking paths here. When we choose to go down path B, that choice to go down path B was really the only way in which things could have unfolded at T1. It looks to us as if we could have gone down path A or down path C, but really that is just an illusion. Because at T1, at that moment in time, there is a long causal chain which has led up to that particular moment. And that long causal chain, which has led up to that particular moment, in conjunction with the laws of nature, makes it that there is really only one physically possible future that can unfold at that moment. And that is us choosing to go down path B. And we'd have to say choosing in scare quotes there, because now we mean something very different when we're talking about choice. Because it looks as if determinism is true, then our conception of free will, more particularly our subjective feeling of free will, is illusory. If everything has a cause, and if natural laws hold, then there's really only one physically possible continuation of things at any given particular moment. Okay, so this is scary for a lot of people, right? Because most of us have a feeling, a subjective feeling of being free. And maybe if we don't think we're free in all instances, we can at least all agree that there are moments in our everyday lives where it seems to us like we are making free choices. However, if determinism is true, then the universe is causally determined in all of its parts. And since our choices are a part of that causally determined universe, then our choices are determined as well. And although it may seem to us as if we are exercising free will or freedom of choice in any particular given instance, given the truth of determinism, then those choices were themselves determined, and we really had no say in the matter. Okay? So determinism is a view which is widely accepted as an intellectual position. It's probably the most agreed upon understanding of how the universe is constituted as a kind of causal mechanism. And what this does is poses a very big problem for any satisfactory notion of freedom of the will. And then that also, since our free will seems to underlie our ascriptions of moral responsibility, makes our ascriptions of moral praise and blame very problematic. Okay, so here's another way to begin thinking about this particular problem. So here's you playing a game of pool, and you pick up the cue stick and you hit the cue ball, and the cue ball hits the 8 ball, and the 8 ball goes into the corner pocket. All right, pretty simple state of affairs here. Now, what most of us think, or at least what it seems like, is that when we move the cue stick and it hits the cue ball, and the cue ball is heading towards the 8 ball, it seems to us like a number of things could happen at that particular moment in time. That the 8 ball could go into the corner pocket, it could hit one of the rails, could miss the pocket, etc. That there are a number of different outcomes at that particular moment in time before the cue ball strikes the 8 ball. However, what determinism states, we'll call this time 2 right here, is that when you strike the cue ball, there is a causal chain which has led up to that particular moment. And that causal chain leading up to that particular moment, in conjunction with the laws of nature, means that there's really only one future at that instance, which is a physically possible future. And you might say, and I think this is a normal intuition to have, aren't other futures physically possible at that given instant? So you see the cue ball heading towards the 8 ball, and you're hoping the 8 ball goes into the corner pocket, but it seems like it could behave differently, right? It could hit one of the rails. Well, what determinism states is that at that moment, when you hit the cue ball, the causal chain, which has led up to that, in conjunction with the laws of nature, makes it so that there's really only one physically possible future which can unfold at that given moment in time. Right? So you might think the 8 ball could go off and do a number of different things. But if determinism is true, then only one future is physically possible given the conditions at T2. Right? So the events which led up to the striking of the cue ball determines that that cue ball is going to go on to do exactly what it is that it is going to do. And that causal chain will kick off further events, and those events will become causes down the line and so forth. But all of that is determined by prior causal states of affairs. So in this instance, you are one of those prior causal states of affairs, right? So let's say at T1, you decide to pick up the cue stick and hit the cue ball. Well, you picking up the cue stick has a causal chain which led up to that particular moment, right? You decided to walk into the room where you're going to play the game of pool to pick up the cue stick, and there are all these events which have led up to that particular moment. And those events, in conjunction with the laws of nature, suggest that you are determined to do precisely what it is that you are going to do in that given instance. And we can push this as far back as we want. Right? Theoretically, we could push it back to the very beginnings of the universe. So now we can see why determinism is a bit of a problem for the conception of free will that we have laid out, and for the conception of moral responsibility, which rests upon this notion of free will. If determinism is true, then we can't ever be said to exercise a free choice in the sense that we could have done otherwise. If at any given moment in time, the causal antecedents which have led up to that moment, in conjunction with the laws of nature, suggest that there is only one physically possible future at that given moment, and since what we mean by free will is the capacity to have done otherwise, if determinism is true, then we really never have a capacity to do otherwise. And our ascriptions of moral praise and blame are essentially meaningless. So you can begin to see why people worry about this particular problem. If the universe is causally determined in the way that a causal determinist thinks, and if that shows that we never actually exercise genuine choice or free choice, then our actions start to become a bit meaningless, or at least it seems that way for some, right? If we really never have a say in what we do, then all of the turmoil and deliberation and emotional anxiety and the emotional stakes that we have in our choices and our decisions are ultimately futile. So some people have wanted to get out of this particular issue, to try and find a way out. And some people have proposed that one way of doing this is by making the case that the universe isn't entirely deterministic, that there are some events or states of affairs which are not caused at all. And this is a view known as indeterminism. And indeterminism states that at least some events that occur have no deterministic cause, but occur randomly. So an indeterminist doesn't think that there are no events which are caused. They just think that at least some of the events which occur in the universe have no deterministic cause. They just occur randomly or spontaneously. Some things just happen out of the blue, and they have no prior deterministic cause. This is the view of indeterminism. Now, if indeterminism were true, that there are some events which have no deterministic cause, then at a given moment, many or some futures are physically possible futures. All right? So if there's no deterministic cause which leads up to T1, where we have to make the choice to go down route A, B, or C, if that were, for instance, an event which happened randomly or spontaneously, then it wasn't predetermined that we would go down path B. We might go down path C or down path A, but the event would just happen spontaneously or randomly. There would be no prior deterministic cause if that were the sort of an event which was undetermined. Now, it's unclear exactly what indeterminism means, and I think it's a difficult idea to grasp. Some people have pointed to quantum mechanics as a possible way of making the case for an indeterministic universe. But we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of indeterminism in order to understand the concept. The concept just suggests that there are some events which are not causally determined. And some people who have wanted to defend freedom of the will have suggested that, well, if indeterminism is true, then this might open up a wedge for us to insert freedom of will. And we'll take a look at the argument for indeterminism and a strong objection to it in just a couple of moments as we turn towards Roderick Chisholm's essay, Human Freedom and the Self. Okay, so if we're thinking about indeterminism, then when the cue ball is heading towards the 8-ball, if that is a type of event which has no prior causal determination, then there would be genuinely other or many physically possible futures at T2, right? And so that's what the indeterminist wants to hold on to try and preserve a conception of free will, that there are at least some events which are not causally determined, and thus many or some futures are physically possible futures at a given moment in time. Okay, so we have our conception of freedom of the will. And essentially what we mean when we're talking about free will is the capacity to have done otherwise. We mean that an action is up to an agent if that agent could have done otherwise than what it was that they did do. If they're walking down the garden of forking paths and they choose to go down path B, they have chosen freely or exercised freedom of will if other options were genuinely open to them, if they could have gone down path A or down path C. However, if determinism is true, then there's really only one physically possible future at any given moment in time. And while it seems to us like we could have done otherwise than choose path B, determinism suggests that when we make the choice to go down path B, that is precisely what we were determined to do. Although it seems to us like we have a genuine choice, we feel this subjective sensation of freedom, that is ultimately an illusion. And the indeterminist tries to get out of this problem by posing that there are some events which occur which have no prior deterministic cause and which just occur randomly. And we'll see why indeterminism is an unsatisfactory answer to the problem of free will in just a moment. Okay, so in the essay Human Freedom and the Self, Roderick Chisholm lays out what he calls the problem of human freedom. And for Chisholm, the problem of human freedom is the conflict between the view that, one, people are responsible for their actions, and both deterministic and indeterministic views of human action. In other words, what Chisholm is saying is that moral responsibility, and hence free will, is incompatible with both a deterministic conception of the universe and an indeterministic one. Both of these views conflict with moral responsibility and freedom of will. So I'm going to read from the text now. Again, this is page 387, and I'm beginning at the beginning here. It starts with a short quote from Aristotle's Physics, which reads, "A staff moves a stone and is moved by a hand, which is moved by a man." And this will become important for Chisholm later on. Here's the first paragraph. The metaphysical problem of human freedom might be summarized in the following way. Human beings are responsible agents, but this fact appears to conflict with a deterministic view of human action. The view that every event that is involved in an act is caused by some other event. And it also appears to conflict with an indeterministic view of human action. The view that the act or some event that is essential to the act is not caused at all. To solve the problem, I believe we must make somewhat far-reaching assumptions about the self or the agent, about the man who performs the act. Okay, so that's a very clear exposition of what Chisholm is calling the problem of human freedom. It's the problem that moral responsibility seems to be incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism. Now, Chisholm is going to spend some time fleshing out why this is a problem, going over some of the issues that we are just speaking about. And then ultimately, what Chisholm is going to do is propose a solution for getting out of this particular problem. That moral responsibility seems to be incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism. Now, it's Chisholm's response to this problem which is really interesting here. Chisholm is going to suggest that there is a way out. Right? So we'll want to be following along making sure we understand what the problem of human freedom is and how Chisholm proposes that we escape the problem. Now, I'll just direct you back down to that last sentence of the paragraph that we just read. Chisholm says, to solve the problem, I believe we must make somewhat far-reaching assumptions about the self or the agent, about the man who performs the act. Right? So what Chisholm is suggesting here is that he is going to make far-reaching assumptions about the self in order to solve the problem. In other words, Chisholm thinks that if we get our conception of the self right, it's going to solve the problem of human freedom. Right? So that's a first indication of the strategy that Chisholm is going to take to solve this particular problem. Okay, so in order to wrap our heads around this, let's look at a particular case. We have some agent, and let's call this agent Agent X. And Agent X, for whatever reason, decides to shoot Agent Y. Maybe Agent X is just a cold-blooded murderer and decides to shoot Agent Y for whatever reason. What would the conditions be for assigning free choice to Agent X? Well, if we take our prior definition of free will and moral responsibility, then we can say that Agent X is responsible for shooting Agent Y when what happened was entirely up to Agent X, and if Agent X could have done otherwise than what he did. So we're going to say that Agent X is responsible for shooting Agent Y when Agent X's shooting of Agent Y was in fact entirely up to Agent X, and Agent X could have done otherwise. That is, he could have decided not to shoot Agent Y. Now remember, that's the whole thrust behind assigning moral praise and blame, is that ability to have done otherwise. So if Agent X could have done otherwise, then he is responsible for shooting Agent Y. He could have decided not to do it, and that is the key issue when it comes to free will, according to Chisholm. So let's look at section 2 here on 387. Right, it's just number 2. Let us consider some deed or misdeed that may be attributed to a responsible agent. One man, say, shot another. If the man was responsible for what he did, then I would urge what was to happen at the time of the shooting was something that was entirely up to the man himself. There was a moment at which it was true both that he could have fired the shot and also that he could have refrained from firing the shot. Right? So that he could have done otherwise. At that moment, he could have either fired the shot or not, and that's what leads us to say that he's responsible. And if this is so, then even though he did fire it, he could have done something else instead. He didn't find himself firing the shot against his will, as we say. Right? So if somebody made Agent X to shoot Agent Y, that would be a different story. So this event then was within Agent X's power to either bring about or not bring about. And when we ask, should Agent X be held responsible for shooting Agent Y, the answer appears to be a clear yes. Okay, continue with the text here. I think we can say more generally then that if a man is responsible for a certain event or a certain state of affairs, in our example, the shooting of another man, then that event or state of affairs was brought about by some act of his, and the act was something that was in his power either to perform or not to perform. But what if Agent X was a Manchurian candidate? That is, what if the event was not really within Agent X's power to either bring about or not bring about, right? So when we're talking about a Manchurian candidate, it's somebody who's essentially brainwashed and programmed to commit a political assassination, right? And just imagining this hypothetical scenario where somebody finds themselves in a condition, they've been brainwashed to perform an assassination, then what they do, Agent X shooting Agent Y, wasn't really within Agent X's control, because what happened wasn't entirely up to Agent X, and Agent X couldn't have done otherwise than what it was that he did do due to the brainwashing. So that makes it seem like Agent X isn't really responsible for shooting Agent Y. And that's because we take away this capacity to have done otherwise when we insert this coercive force from the outside on somebody's action. This is often why we don't hold people responsible for their actions when they are coerced to do something against their will. Okay. So the view that Chisholm is laying out here, he's given us a particular case to begin thinking about what's going on with assignments of moral responsibility and free will. There is a position in the philosophical literature known as hard determinism. And what this position states is that free will and moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism. So if determinism is true, then no action is genuinely free. And we're going to look at the argument for this particular case right now. So this is at the top of 388, first full paragraph. But now, if the act which he did perform was an act that was also in his power not to perform, then it could not have been caused or determined by any event that was not itself within his power either to bring about or not to bring about. For example, if what we say he did was really something that was brought about by a second man, one who forced his hand upon the trigger, say, or who by means of hypnosis compelled him to perform the act, then since the act was caused by the second man, it was nothing that was within the power of the first man to prevent. So this is our Manchurian Candidate example. When there is, for instance, a second agent causing Agent X to shoot Agent Y, forcing Agent X to shoot Agent Y, then we say that Agent X isn't responsible for what he's done because his capacity to have done otherwise is gone. He is determined to do exactly what it is that he is going to do. Okay, so we continue here with Chisholm in the text. And precisely the same thing is true, I think. If instead of referring to a second man who compelled the first one, we speak instead of the desires and beliefs which the first man happens to have had. Okay, I'm going to read that again. And precisely the same thing is true, I think, if instead of referring to a second man who compelled the first one, we speak instead of the desires and beliefs which the first man happens to have had. So Chisholm is making an analogy here between the examples. When we have the example of Agent X being coerced by somebody from the outside, say through brainwashing or hypnosis, we want to say that Agent X is not free. Agent X was coerced, couldn't have done otherwise, and therefore cannot be held morally responsible for his actions. Now, Chisholm is saying that the hard determinist is committed to saying that we mean the same thing when instead of referring to a second agent, coercing Agent X to shoot Agent Y, we refer instead to Agent X's beliefs and desires. So Agent X's beliefs and desires stand in the same relation to the shooting of Agent Y as does the second agent who coerced Agent X into shooting Agent Y. So why would Chisholm say that this is the case? Well, what is the cause of the beliefs and the desires that lead to Agent X shooting Agent Y? surely if at some point Agent X acquired those beliefs and desires, and if determinism is true, that for every event which occurs, some cause or causes exist, then Agent X was caused to have the beliefs and desires which led to the shooting of Agent Y. That is, the beliefs and desires which led to the shooting of Agent Y were determined prior to Agent X having those beliefs and those desires. So back to the text here. For if what we say he did was really something that was brought about by his own beliefs and desires, if these beliefs and desires in the particular situation in which he happened to have found himself caused him to do just what it was that we say he did do, then since they caused it, he was unable to do anything other than just what it was that he did do. So if Agent X's beliefs and desires were the cause of him shooting Agent Y, and if Agent X was determined to have those beliefs and those desires, then Agent X had no say in whether he was going to shoot Agent Y. Agent X was determined to shoot Agent Y. This is the position of the hard determinist, that our beliefs and our desires are causally determined by causal antecedents in conjunction with the laws of nature outside of our control. And so whatever it is that we do, we are determined to do given the causal state of the universe. So Agent X did not cause his beliefs and desires. The beliefs and the desires, however, caused the firing of the gun. And then we ask, what caused Agent X to have the beliefs and desires he did in fact have? Well, if determinism is true, then they must have been caused by some previous event. Right? So there was some other event which led to Agent X having those beliefs and those desires. Maybe it was a bad childhood, which then led to the firing of the gun. And then we can trace the causal chain even further back. So what were the causes of leading to Agent X having the bad childhood? What were the causes of those causes? So on and so forth. And we can trace that causal chain right back to the beginning. So if X's beliefs and desires were caused by an event which was not up to him, then he cannot be said to have caused the event. He cannot be said to have done otherwise. Again, this is the position of hard determinism, that free will is an illusion. If determinism is true, then there is no room for free will in this picture of things. I'm going to continue with the text here. It makes no difference whether the cause of the deed was internal or external. If the cause was some state or event for which the man himself was not responsible, then he was not responsible for what we have been mistakenly calling his act. Right? So that's key there. If the cause was some state or event for which the man himself was not responsible, then he was not responsible for what we have been mistakenly calling his act. If a flood, I'll throw this up here, if a flood caused the poorly constructed dam to break, then given the flood and the constitution of the dam, the break, we may say, had to occur and nothing could have happened in its place. And if the flood of desire caused the weak-willed man to give in, then he too had to do just what it was that he did do, and he was no more responsible than was the dam for the results that followed. Right? I think that's a very nice description of the position of hard determinism. Right? So this picture of a dam, and then a flood causing the dam to give way. And given the constitution of the dam at the particular time when the flood occurs, given that the dam is constituted poorly, that dam is determined to break. There is nothing which will stop the dam from breaking given the way in which it's constructed. It has to happen. And then Chisholm is making the analogy here with Agent X shooting Agent Y. And if the flood of desire caused the weak-willed man to give in, then he too had to do just what it was that he did do, and he was no more responsible than was the dam for the result that followed. Okay, so here we have our picture of hard determinism, which is free will skepticism. And this is the first part of human freedom, where Chisholm says moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism. This is the view that free will is incompatible with determinism. If determinism is true, then free will must be an illusion. Okay, so that's the first part of it. The next part of it is that Chisholm states that indeterminism is also incompatible with free will. Okay, so let's move to that branch of the argument real quick. It's a bit shorter and we can take care of this piece pretty quickly. So again, indeterminism is the view that at least some events that occur have no deterministic cause but occur randomly. So Agent X's firing of the gun was not caused at all, or it just came about by chance. There was no prior causal determinant which led to the firing of the gun. It just happened randomly or spontaneously. Now the question is, if X's firing of the gun was not caused at all, can X be held accountable for the act? Some people have suggested that if the universe is indeterministic, then maybe that makes room for freedom of the will, right? Because then we have some events which are not causally determined. And if Agent X's firing the gun was not causally determined, do we think that that will allow us to say that Agent X was responsible for bringing about the event? If X can be held accountable, we should be able to say he brought the event about. The problem with indeterminism giving room for free will, however, is that if he didn't cause the event, then he can't be said to have brought it about, right? So if the firing of the gun just happens randomly or spontaneously, if there was no prior cause which led up to that moment of Agent X firing the gun, if it just happened spontaneously or randomly by chance, then Agent X can't be said to be held accountable for it. Because if it happened by chance, then he didn't decide to do it. It just happened randomly or spontaneously. And it doesn't seem like we want to assign responsibility to events which occur just by chance or randomly out of the blue. It seems like in order to assign responsibility, we need to say that there was some cause there and that the cause was the agent. But if it just happens randomly or spontaneously, then nobody was there to be responsible for the action. So that fills out our problem of human freedom. Neither determinism nor indeterminism can adequately account for human freedom. Okay, so you might want to take just a moment here and make sure that you understand what the problem of human freedom is. And again, just to summarize it really quick, the problem of human freedom, according to Chisholm, is that human freedom seems to be incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism. Human freedom is incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism, then there is no human freedom. That's the problem, right? If either of these choices are true, which seem to be our two choices for taking a view on the universe, things are either causally determined or they're not, then if both of those are incompatible with human freedom, then human freedom seems to be out the window. Now, it's a troubling problem if you think that there's something to our subjective feelings of freedom, and those aren't completely illusory. I happen to think, for instance, that they are not completely illusory and that there is something very significant and meaningful about our subjective feelings of freedom that we need to give a philosophical account for. And so, I would suggest that we need to propose a solution to the problem of human freedom. And we're going to take a look now at one attempt to do that, and then at Chisholm's attempt to solve the problem. Okay, so one way that philosophers have gone about trying to solve this problem is by developing a position which is known as compatibilism. And compatibilism is the view that free will, moral responsibility is compatible with determinism, right? So this is the view which says something like this. Yes, determinism is true. There's only one physically possible future at any given moment. However, we can still make sense of free will within a causally determined cosmos. So the compatibilist thinks that free will and determinism are compatible. That's why they're called compatibilists. The question is what kind of argument that can the compatibilist give in order to respond to this problem? Another name for compatibilism is soft determinism. It's contrasted with the view of hard determinism that we just looked at, which says that free will and determinism are incompatible. Compatibilism, or soft determinism, says that determinism is compatible with free will. Okay, let me walk that back just a second. So let's look at section 3 on page 388. That's on the right hand column of the page near the bottom. And we'll look at the sentence right before that and go from there. There is one standard objection to all of this, and we should consider it briefly. The objection takes the form of a stratagem, one designed to show that determinism and divine providence is consistent with human responsibility. The stratagem is one that was used by Jonathan Edwards and by many philosophers of the present century, most notably G.E. Moore. One proceeds as follows. The expression A, he could have done otherwise, it is argued, means no more nor less than B. If he had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. In place of chosen, one might say tried, set out, decided, undertaken, or willed. The truth of statement B, it is then pointed out, is consistent with determinism and with divine providence. For even if all of the man's actions were causally determined, the man could still be such that if he had chosen otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. What the murderer saw, let us suppose, along with his beliefs and desires, caused him to fire the shot. Yet he was such that if, just then, he had chosen or decided not to fire the shot, then he would not have fired it. All of this is certainly possible. Okay, so let's try and break this down and see what the compatibilist is arguing here. So what the compatibilist argues, is we go back to our example of agent X shooting agent Y, is that what we mean when we utter the phrase, agent X could have done otherwise, is the same thing that we mean when we utter, if agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. Right? So if agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise means the same thing according to the compatibilist as agent X could have done otherwise. Okay, so what is this saying? The claim is that A and B mean the same thing. And since we have already decided, and we decided this early on in our defining of free will, that agent X could have done otherwise is compatible with moral responsibility, that's what we mean when we say somebody is morally responsible for their actions and therefore free. If A is compatible with free will and A means the same thing as B, then B, if agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise, is compatible with the view of causal determinism. Right? So, A, agent X could have done otherwise, just means B, if agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. So what we need to wrap our heads around here is why Chisholm is saying the compatibilist thinks that B is compatible with determinism and why B means the same thing as A. So on the face of it, these two statements say different things. A says agent X could have done otherwise, and B states that if agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. So we've got to figure out why those mean the same thing. So B, if agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. This is an easy claim to understand. All that this states is that if things had been different for agent X, If, for instance, the conditions of Agent X's childhood had been slightly different, then in the moment when Agent X is deciding whether to shoot Agent Y, it could have come about that Agent X refrained from pulling the trigger. So if we just change the causal antecedents which lead up to that particular moment a little bit, we can say that if Agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. Right? So that's a view which is completely compatible with determinism. Right? In this universe, Agent X's beliefs and desires were such that those beliefs and desires were going to cause him to shoot Agent Y. But if things had been slightly different, then Agent X would have had a different set of beliefs and desires, which would have led him to not shooting Agent Y. So if things had been slightly different, then Agent X would have behaved differently. Now, what the compatibilist wants to argue is that, so since that claim in B, if Agent X had chosen to do otherwise than he would have done otherwise, is compatible with determinism, and since B means the same thing as A, Agent X could have done otherwise, then A itself, Agent X could have done otherwise, is compatible with determinism. Right? So here's a quick way of breaking it down. Let's say in a parallel universe, Agent X does not have the murderous beliefs and desires. It would then be the case that he would have done otherwise than what it was that he did do. Thus, determinism is compatible with free will. What we mean when we say Agent X could have done otherwise is that if Agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise. So if you're feeling dissatisfied with this argument, that is a good thing, because it is a terrible argument, because it does a huge injustice to what we mean when we say Agent X could have done otherwise. So the quick way of showing that this argument is false, there is some semantic appeal to it, and a number of philosophers have tried to put forward some version or another of this argument, but I think it's ultimately flawed, because saying that if Agent X had chosen to do otherwise, then he would have done otherwise doesn't mean that Agent X really could have done otherwise in the situation that he found himself. When Agent X shot Agent Y, he was determined to do so by the causal events which led up to that particular moment. It may be that in some alternate universe, some closely paralleled universe, Agent X had a different set of beliefs and desires which would have led him to behave differently. It's still the case that in this universe in which Agent X finds himself, he couldn't have done otherwise than what it was that he did do. So ultimately, in order to object to the compatibilist argument, and it's the objection that Chisholm raises, is that A and B don't really mean the same thing. The compatibilist is trying to force these two conceptions together, and it really doesn't work. And I think that's right. It does a lot of damage to the semantic content of statement A here, that Agent X could have done otherwise, when we try to say that it means the same thing as B. Right, so here's Chisholm's objection. If Agent X had chosen to do otherwise than he would have done otherwise, doesn't entail he could have chosen to do otherwise, right? Because that's really the key element that we're trying to get a grip on here, is that when Agent X is in that intense moment as he's about to pull the trigger, we want to know if he could do otherwise in that moment. And if determinism is true, then Agent X is determined to do exactly what it is he is going to do in that moment. There's nothing he can do to change that, right? If things had been different, he would behave differently. But given the causal state of the universe, things are going to unfold in exactly the way that they're going to unfold. So he couldn't really have chosen to have done otherwise, even if things were slightly different in a parallel universe. So what we would need to be able to say is that Agent X could have chosen to do otherwise, and that seems to be exactly what causal determinism throws off the table. So Chisholm ends up just saying he could have chosen to do otherwise, right? He could have made that choice. There were genuine options open to him. That view of free will is incompatible with determinism. And so we're still back in the mud of the problem of human freedom, and we've got to find a way out of it. Okay, so let's begin to look at what Chisholm's response is to the problem of human freedom. Okay, so at this stage in the game, you should have a grasp on what the problem of human freedom is, right? And now, what's the compatibilist response to the problem of human freedom? I just want to make sure that you're aware that there is this position in response to the problem of human freedom. So what's the problem of human freedom? What's the compatibilist response to the problem of human freedom? And now, what is Chisholm's response to the problem of human freedom? Given that we've seen that the compatibilist argument doesn't really hold sway, let's take a look at what another attempt to solve the problem looks like. And this is the solution which is proposed by Chisholm. Chisholm proposes that we can solve the problem of human freedom by making a distinction between two types of causation. Right? And the two types of causation that Chisholm wants to make a distinction between is what he calls event causation, or the fancy term that he uses for it is transient causation. And he's going to distinguish that from what he calls agent causation, or the more fancy term he uses for that is immanent causation. We're going to want to see why Chisholm thinks that making this decision helps us get out of the problem of human freedom. Okay, so let's look at section 6 here. This is on page 389, second column of the page, down at near the bottom, section 6. If we consider only inanimate natural objects, we may say that causation, if it occurs, is a relation between events or states of affairs. The dam's breaking was an event that was caused by a set of other events, the dam being weak, the flood being strong, and so on. But if a man is responsible for a particular deed, then if what I have said is true, there is some event or set of events that is not caused, if what I have said is true, there is some event or state of affairs that is caused, not by other events or states of affairs, but by the agent, whatever he may be. I shall borrow a pair of medieval terms, using them perhaps in a way that is slightly different from that for which they were originally intended. I shall say that when one event or state of affairs, or set of events or states of affairs, causes some other event or state of affairs, then we have an instance of transient causation. Right? That's event causation. And I shall say that when an agent, as distinguished from an event, causes an event or state of affairs, then we have an instance of immanent causation. Okay, so what's the distinction here? So how does Chisholm propose we get out of the problem of human freedom? Well, we need to make this distinction between these different types of causation. So on the one hand, we have event causation, or what he's calling transient causation. And what we mean by event causation is simply the conception of causation that most of us work with all the time. This is when we talk about an event being caused by another event. So if we go back to our billiard ball table, we have the cue ball, which is causing the 8 ball to go into the corner pocket. And we have one event, which causes another event, which causes another event, and so on and so forth down the line. And these are these long causal chains that we've been speaking about leading up to any particular event in conjunction with the laws of nature. So this is a pretty standard and straightforward way of understanding cause and effect. It's a relationship between events. One event causes another event, which causes another event, and so forth. So in the case of agent X shooting agent Y, if we think about this from the perspective of event causation, and this is the way a hard determinist and even most compatibilists think about the event, well, there is a relationship between events, right? So presumably there is a neurological event which occurs in the brain, which causes the muscle contractions in the arm and the hand, which causes the man to pull the trigger, which causes the shooting of the gun, which causes Agent Y to be shot. And all of this can be understood in terms of the relationship between the various events. One event causes another event, which causes another event. And this is pretty straightforward. Now, what Chisholm's suggestion here is that what we ought to do is make a distinction between this normal way of thinking causation and another type of causation which exists in the universe, which is distinguished from event causation. And he calls this agent causation or immanent causation. So what agent causation states is that so an agent cause is an event which is not caused by other events, but by the agent him or herself, right? So what Chisholm is saying here is, look, we have event causation in the universe. One event causes another event, which causes another event. But there is another type of causal power which exists in the universe, another type of causal event, and this is the type of causation which arises from an agent him or herself. And he calls it immanent causation because he thinks that causal power resides within agents, but it's a different type of causal power than that which exists between events. So an agent can cause events, causes flow from agents, but the agent is not him or herself caused. So this is not a relationship between an event and an event, as in the case of event causation. It's a relation between an agent and an event. And Chisholm thinks that there's a very important difference here. So when we're looking at event causation in the situation where agent X shoots agent Y, and we're just looking at it in terms of event causation, there's some neurological event which causes the contraction of the muscles, which causes the shooting of the gun. But when we're looking at the situation from the perspective of agent causation, we can say, yes, there is this long chain of transient causes or event causes. But there is also another sort of cause which exists in this relationship, which is different from a mere event cause, and that is an agent cause. So it is an agent which brings about, which causes the event in the brain, which then leads to the relationship between the brain event, the muscle contractions, and the shooting of the gun. So the agent kicks off this causal chain. The agent is the source of this causal chain, but the agent is not him or herself caused by another event. Okay, so essentially what Chisholm is suggesting is that, look, we have this causally determined universe, right? There are all these events which occur, and we can understand these events in principle if we can look at the causal chains which led up to them. But there are some events which exist in the universe which Chisholm thinks stand outside of this causal order. So the agent is able to make changes to this causal order, kick off new causal chains, new events, but the agent is not him or herself caused by other events. And Chisholm argues that this distinction gets us out of the problem of human freedom. So let's look back at the text here. This is the first full paragraph on page 390. The nature of what is intended by the expression immanent causation, right, that's agent causation, may be illustrated by this sentence from Aristotle's Physics. Thus, a staff moves a stone and is moved by a hand, which is moved by a man. If the man was responsible, then we have in this illustration a number of instances of causation, most of them transient, but at least one of them immanent. So most of the causes which are occurring in this instance of staff moves a stone is moved by a hand, which is moved by a man, most of these causes are event causes, transient causes, relationships between events. But at least one of them, Chisholm says, is an immanent cause, an agent cause. What the staff did to the stone was an instance of transuent causation, and thus we may describe it as a relation between events. The motion of the staff caused the motion of the stone. And similarly, for what the hand did to the staff, the motion of the hand caused the motion of the staff. And as we know from physiology, there are still other events which cause the motion of the hand. Hence, we need not introduce the agent at this particular point, as Aristotle does. We need not, though we may. We may say that the hand was moved by the man, but we may also say that the motion of the hand was caused by the motion of certain muscles, and we may say that the motion of the muscles was caused by certain events that took place within the brain. But some event, and presumably one of those that took place within the brain, was caused by the agent and not by any other events. Right? So that's the key. Chisholm thinks that there are certain events which cause other events, but which are not themselves caused. Right? So this might seem a little bit weird, because then the question is, well, what kind of event is this? But, Chisholm tells us at the very beginning of the paper, to solve the problem, I believe, we must make somewhat far-reaching assumptions about the self or the agent. So now you can see the type of assumption that Chisholm is making about the self or the agent. He's saying that the agent is capable of bringing about changes to the causal order of things, but is not him or herself caused. Now, Chisholm thinks that this is the way in which we get out of the problem of human freedom, and it rests on this pretty large assumption about the nature of the agent. The agent, according to Chisholm, is metaphysically free. Metaphysically, the agent is able to cause change to the causal order, but is not him or herself caused. And this means that we can say that agent X caused the shooting of agent Y, right? So if agent X shooting agent Y, in that description, agent X is the agent cause, then it makes perfect sense to say that agent X was the cause of shooting agent Y. And if Chisholm is right, and this type of agent causation or imminent causation is correct, then agent X was not himself caused to shoot agent Y. However, he was the cause. Agent X did cause the shooting of agent Y, but agent X was not himself caused to shoot agent Y, right? So if agent X caused the shooting of agent Y, then that gets us out of the problem of indeterminism, because the event doesn't just happen randomly or by chance. Agent X really was the cause of agent Y being shot. And if agent causation is correct, then it's also the case that agent X was not himself caused to shoot agent Y. And that gets us out of the problem of determinism. Because if agent causation is a thing, then there are certain types of events which occur in the world, agent causations, which are not themselves caused by other events. That means that the agent wasn't determined to do what it was that he was going to do. That the action really flowed from agent X, and that agent X was the cause of shooting agent Y. So this view is known as libertarianism. And libertarianism is a position that can be taken in the free will debate, and it's not the same thing as political libertarianism. So you need to make sure that you distinguish this from political libertarianism, because this doesn't mean the same thing. Libertarianism in philosophy, in the position as a position to the problem of free will, states that some human actions are freely chosen, but not all of these events are caused. Some human actions are freely chosen, but not all of them are caused. Right? At least some events that occur have no deterministic cause, but are themselves the causes of other events. And agents are just such events. They have no deterministic cause. There is nothing which determines that an agent is going to behave in the way the agent does behave. The behavior of the agent is immanent to the agent him or herself. It flows out from the agent. The agent isn't determined to do what he is going to do. Determination comes from the agent. So the agent is not caused, but is him or herself the cause of other events. So now, of course, the question here is, this is a pretty weird view, right? It's a pretty weird metaphysical view because it suggests that there is something very special about the agent, and that this specialness of the agent leads to the solution of the problem of human freedom. So if the agent caused the brain event, what kind of cause is it? Are any of us really clear about what this agent causation is? I myself am a bit unsure exactly what Chisholm means by agent causation. It's not entirely clear. I think it's a very interesting solution to the problem, but it's not totally clear what kind of cause it is. But Chisholm thinks that we need to posit agent causation in order to get out of the problem, right? And he thinks that logically we ought to accept that there are these types of agent causes in the universe. Okay, so if this agent cause were a transient cause or an event cause, then it would have been brought about by some previous event, right? And that would throw us right back into the problem of determinism and not lead us out of the problem of human freedom. So the agent can't be like these other types of causes, like the brain event, like the muscles contracting, like the movement of the hand, etc. The agent must be a different type of cause. And Chisholm suggests that the agent must be a prime mover unmoved. Okay, so the agent must be a prime mover unmoved. So again, Chisholm says that he's going to make some far-reaching assumptions about the self, and indeed, this is a far-reaching assumption about the self. The agent is a prime mover unmoved. Now, usually this is a description of a deity, right? Of a deity which creates the universe. A being which itself can cause the creation of the universe, but which is not itself caused. And Chisholm seems to suggest that agents are like this. They're not themselves gods, right? Because they're not creating the entire universe, but they have this type of power. They're prime movers unmoved. They can cause things to happen. They can make events happen in the world, but they are not themselves caused. They are prime movers unmoved. Okay, so turn to page 392 and section 11 here. And this is where Chisholm states this. If we are responsible, and if what I have been trying to say is true, then we have a prerogative which some would attribute only to God. Each of us, when we act, is a prime mover unmoved. In doing what we do, we cause certain events to happen, and nothing or no one causes us to cause those events to happen. Right? So if we are responsible and if what I have been trying to say is true, then we have a prerogative which some would attribute only to God. We are prime movers unmoved. And so Chisholm thinks that if we adopt this assumption about the self, selves are prime movers unmoved, if we think about our actions in this way, and what we are and how we are metaphysically constituted as prime movers unmoved, then this solves the problem. This solves the problem of human freedom. Now, of course, this runs into all sorts of problems. You can clearly see that this is a problematic view to take. I'm sure you've immediately thought of a number of different objections to this position. But one reason to maybe slow down and give it some more consideration is to really try and understand what Chisholm is doing here, right? So we all have this feeling that we make free choices and that we can be held responsible for our actions and that other people can be held responsible for our actions. We might feel this to different degrees, but I doubt that anyone does not feel this at all, right? So So there is a strong reason for wanting to preserve a conception of free will. And what Chisholm is saying here is that if we're going to do that, if we're going to hold on to a robust conception of freedom, the type of freedom that most of us feel that we have, then we need to be able to give an account of it. And this is the account that Chisholm thinks we are logically led to if we are going to hold on to a conception of free will. Okay? So Chisholm is led here by his reasoning, and he's led to this position as a consequence of the problem of human freedom. And he thinks that this is the position that our subjective feelings of freedom really recommend to us as the account which can make sense of that feeling of freedom. Okay, so that's Chisholm's argument, right? It's a little weird. It's a metaphysical argument about the nature of human freedom. Human agents are prime movers unmoved. And like I said, there should be a number of different objections which are occurring to you as you go over this. And what this piece does a really good job at doing is laying out the terrain of the debate. And as we move to the next paper, Harry Frankfurt, Moral Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility, Frankfurt proposes a response to the problem, but he does it in a different way. So Frankfurt, for instance, is a compatibilist. He gives a different version of the compatibilist argument, which I think is much stronger than the one we looked at in this lecture. But Frankfurt is going to try and resolve the issue, and this is essentially what the debate does. Different people have different responses to this problem, and essentially you need to try to start to articulate to yourself what you think the best solution to this problem is, the best solution given the materials that you have here to work with. Okay, so that's Chisholm's argument. Just a possible objection here that can be raised to Chisholm. Like I said, there's a number of different objections, but here is, I suppose it's sort of an obvious objection that you could raise. And the objection runs like this. If agent X is the agent cause of his decision to shoot agent Y, so if agent X is the agent cause of his decision to shoot agent Y, then agent X becoming the agent cause of his decision to shoot agent Y is itself an event, right? So if you say that agent X is the agent cause of shooting agent Y, then that process of agent X becoming the agent cause of his decision to shoot agent Y is itself an event. And if it's an event, then it must be either determined or indeterminate. It must be determined or not determined at all. In other words, if it's an event which occurs in the world, agent X becoming the agent cause of shooting agent Y, then that is an event which must be either deterministic or indeterministic. And so it's unclear if Chisholm has really gotten out of the problem of human freedom here, because it seems like if this is an event which occurs, and we'll even say that agent X is becoming the agent cause of shooting agent Y, well, that itself must be an event, and it must exist within the structure of the cosmos. And if it exists within the structure of the cosmos, then it must be determined or either indeterminate. And so we're back into the problem of human freedom if this objection holds. Now, this is an objection that needs to be developed further, but it is a strong way to begin objecting to Chisholm and to be thinking about why Chisholm's position to the problem of human freedom might be not so satisfactory. So I'll leave things here for you with this. And when we meet again on Monday, December 3rd, we'll start talking about Harry Frankfurt's piece, Alternate Possibilities and Moral Responsibility. All right, see you then.